Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 11th episode of the Overanalyst podcast. Today I'm doing the intro. My name is Martina or Seth the Overwitch on Twitch. I am joined by Mate or Comrade Potato on Twitch.
Boo, bring back Brady as an intro guy.
Fuck you. And of course, Brady, the Overanalyst on Twitch.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all doing well. Thanks for swinging by.
And for today's episode, we also have a guest. We have MC from Ferris Moon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I hope you will enjoy this.
So, the idea for today's episode would be a discussion or some sort of a debate between pro and con view about antagonistic game design and how it evolved throughout the history. So, but let's go through first thing first. MC, can you tell me a little bit more? Well, tell the viewers a little bit more about what Ferris Moon does.
Yeah, Earth Moon is basically a small company where we gather together to produce a mod for a game named Uplink by Introversion Software. The mod in itself is called Unlink, and currently we are making another game, the guide that we are working on the background for.
All right, great. So, Brady, do you want to start with presenting today's issue?
Certainly, I'll present my issue, the issue, but not my argument. I think if it's amenable to him, I'll give MC the first word insofar as presenting like evidence or an argument. And firstly, MC, I want to thank you personally for joining us today. For those who are not aware in our audience, MC was probably my Twitch channel's first really consistent supporter and my first moderator back when we started growing an actual community instead of me just firing off test sessions in like very early 2018. So I'm so grateful to you for being a part of our community, man, for your support, and I'm so happy that you could join us for this discussion.
I'm happy to be here, and it's it's really nice to see how you managed to grow on Twitch, and I'm glad I could help you achieve that. You sure have gone a long way from the jammer evolution.
Oh, so true. Still need to get around to finishing Hand of Fate 2 at some point. We do. But yes, so glad to have you here. And today we're going to be kind of arguing the merits question mark of what collectively we've termed antagonistic game design, or a series of design principles and mechanics that were typified. I don't know, MC, would you say probably more in old school CRPGs from the 90s than in any other genre?
Well, it's more apparent in older game design, I would say, but it's also present in some fashion in more modern genre and other other medium in general. Because, well, you see, the essence of being antagonistic in a game design, going against the player, is that you always want to give the player a challenge in one way or another. But sometimes it's easier to confront the player rather than to uh, just put a thing that you don't expect anything from the player and just letting him do his thing. If you put a challenge against him, you have to show him that yes, sometimes uh, you are not prepared for that encounter because you haven't considered all the possibilities, and you need to rethink your ways to be able to progress from this point on. So that could
Mhm.
apply in older game design, but also newer. It's just more present in older game design because the clunkiness of the controls are often a challenge for the players that shouldn't be there in the first place.
Mhm. And is this your opening statement, or is there more you would like to say to kind of found your argument? I'm sorry, this is a little clunky. We've never done a show in this format before.
It's okay, we are experimenting. Um, but I would say that this is certainly one of the main points that I have to bring on the table, but there are other things that we can discuss over time, like um, how certain enemies in certain game can break the rules of
Mm-hmm.
the world to to fight the player. Like you would try to do something that you expect from an enemy, and it would just say, "Nope, you went the wrong way. Try again." And it might not even be fair. Like um, contextual contextual interaction with a boss, like where you have to trigger a certain part of the area rather than targeting the boss because that boss cannot be vanquished any other way, even though you vanquish all other bosses through regular method. That can really break the immersion of the game and thus
Mm-hmm.
lead the player in a sense that the game is against them, even though it's not. And I would argue that this kind of design might be useful in certain circumstances, especially when you want to teach young audience why uh, putting rules in the game is important for everyone, because this is something that you can see um, in a younger audience where they want to change the rule
Yep.
they every time it puts something against them, and then well, if they are confronted to that, they are faced with why that might be an issue, or why it can also be an interesting challenge to solve because you haven't thought about it. But like there certainly are merits to it, I think.
Okay. No, and I would, despite the fact that I'm going to be advancing what largely is the opposite argument, and something I generally adhere to, I don't believe there's much place for antagonistic design in games. I will concede happily that there are certain applications wherein it can be useful with the postscript that, at least from the outset, and we'll talk about this more with one of the examples of antagonistic design I would like us to focus on it for at least a couple minutes today, the explicit disclaimer that antagonistic measures, antagonistic design, or mechanics are going to be presented to the player, and not that the challenge of the game, as it's being sold, as it's being offered you as an experience, is fair and balanced and relatively even handed. Now, I've drawn up, and by which I mean I've paced around my kitchen for about an hour and a half, attempting to riddle out what I believe define antagonistic design to me. And really quickly, I would like to share with you guys just a few of the criteria that I established. And a lot of mine, I'm sorry, I'm not very technically minded, are kind of vague and ephemeral. But more than anything else, I would define antagonistic design as excessive, very esoterically informed, as in informed by typically expert knowledge of the mechanical underpinnings of a system or by the developer's intent behind crafting a world or experience. So, excessive, esoterically informed curation of player experience and agency. So, MCU talked about the importance of tools and informing players of various ways in which they can or should use them. I agree wholeheartedly that this is at the heart of a lot of really good intuitive game design. I think about Dark Souls, which is not a series I would associate antagonistic design with in the least, because the series presents you with so many different tools and types of builds and weapons and items you can play around with. And to a greater or lesser extent, especially from the second entry onward, does its level best to make most of them viable. If you really want to run through the entire game with a halberd, or using miracles or hexes or what have you, you certainly can, and the game doesn't punish you for doing so. But oftentimes, in the types of games and experiences I associate with antagonistic design, that freedom, that even handedness is not present in the least. And instead, hold on, where are my other criteria? These games restrict or exclude ostensibly viable playstyles, in other words, those presented to the player as legitimate, and tools and etc., because they don't conform to extremely specific intended use cases of the same as conceived by the developers. I call this puzzle box design. Regardless of the tools or approaches offered to players, they have one or few highly specific intended solutions. Sorry, most encounters have one or a few highly specific intended solutions, which the player is penalized for not conforming to very tightly. And again, I can provide specifics later, but this to me is what is at the heart of a lot of this antagonistic design and why I feel it should generally be discouraged from application. If I want my player to be immersed, as you said, if I want them to play around with my world and explore while presenting them very fair, consistent challenges, I don't also want to constantly be slapping their hand and telling them, no, don't do it that way, do it this way. You deserve whatever penalties I place upon you because you didn't use the tools I created exactly as I intended them to be. There's one tool or a handful of tools for job A, for job B, and so on. Your creativity, your agency has no place here instead of little place here.
That is a fair assessment. And yeah, I mean, that's represent more or less what I have in mind for antagonistic gameplay as well. And the point where I would disagree is that Dark Souls, in essence, has some antagonistic elements to it in the way death is handled, because you can permanently lose a lot of souls and
Mm-hmm.
thus have to conform to a certain types of weapon or whatever because you couldn't beat the boss with the way you wanted to, and you cannot prepare yourself better because you lost everything that you had. So in that sense, it can be quite antagonistic, but I don't think it is in a bad way because it's still a penalty that you have to accept to be able to progress. Like you cannot take your souls for granted in that game.
Um, that's very true. That's absolutely correct. The distinction I would draw is actually between Dark Souls and Demon Souls, and I would add the caveat that in most cases in one of the Dark Souls games, you generally have a presentable assessment of risk. Like, when you enter a boss arena, for instance, odds are good you're probably not going to get that on the first try, and that if you have a bunch of souls, or you enter an area that looks like it could be a boss arena, you might either want to spend them or accept the choice or the possibility of losing them. And likewise for certain encounters with new or unique enemies that you usually, not always, I will concede that the Dark Souls or the Soulsborne franchise, I think Bloodborne especially, has a lot of traps that you can't see coming, and that could constitute elements of antagonistic design, albeit not an overall ethos of antagonistic design. But I would say Dark Souls does not punish you for trying new things or trying to tackle challenges in unorthodox manners or those that are not ideal as designed by the devs, because there is a skill based element. Even if, for instance, I'm not using the best weapon or a weapon my character is ideally suited for, if I'm able to assess visually and observe an enemy's movements, the things they're doing, what their animations look like, I can learn enough about them to evade most or all of their attacks, and that's presented to me in a very fair manner. For instance, halfway through what was one of the really tough fights from Dark Souls 1, the Manus fight, for instance. Um, the boss gains a couple of new attacks, but it doesn't, for instance, start performing the attacks I've already learned how to dodge twice as fast or dealing twice as much damage or anything like that because I wasn't kitted out a certain way. The closest the series comes to anything like that is, I think, actually the Fume Knight fight in the second game, where the boss will immediately proceed to its second, faster, and more damaging form if you're wearing certain elements of an armor set that's associated with one of its enemies in lore. But no, Demon Souls has antagonistic game design. Anybody here familiar with the world tendency mechanic? Oh, Lord. So, World Tendency was a flexible difficulty curve for Demon Souls that was only ever used for that title. Depending on certain aspects of the player experience, the game would either become easier or harder, with weaker or more powerful enemies spawning, and as you would expect, the rewards tended to increase with the difficulty curve. But here's the really messed up part. World Tendency would shift to make the game harder the more the player died, and easier the more bosses they defeated with relatively few deaths, creating an inverse difficulty curve. Which, to me, does constitute antagonistic game design because of another of the criteria I wrote down. Excessive punishment of the player or deprivation of tools as like penalty for failure. One of the reasons why I would claim the Dark Souls series generally averts antagonistic design is especially from the second game on, yeah, you might die. You might die a lot. But usually, it's not going to be too difficult with things like shortcuts or bonfires being placed quite close to boss arenas to at least get back to the point where you did die, to that challenge that you hadn't overcome yet. And the game doesn't usually attempt to discourage you from doing that with minimal harm, with minimal risk or investment on the player's part. Contrast that with, say, some of the boss runs present in the first game, like the Ornstein and Smough boss run through virtually all of Anor Londo that poor Seth got quite well acquainted with. And you can argue that that style of design was relatively antagonistic, but it's something the devs tried to reduce over time, rather than embrace, as I would argue a lot of old school CRPG developers did.
Well, if I may just interject there for a second, I don't feel that that particular fight was antagonistic. I kind of looked at it as more of like a final exam kind of thing.
Oh no, not
like,
the fight. Not the fight at all. The forcing you to run through like most of the stage every time you died.
Okay, yeah.
Because no, bad player, you're supposed to do it like this. And you deserve whatever the penalty is for not immediately.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Yeah, that run was especially annoying. The part where I had to summon the guy with the sun. How is it called? Solaire, yeah, and every time he would get stuck somewhere and then I would die because the other things were chasing me. And I feel like the only time where I was successful with that was when all the stars were aligned and the RNG gods were very kind to me.
But that in particular feels more like the clunkiness of the AI. And Orlando is, let's say, it's made to die.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of pitfalls. It's a challenge about traversing the level, and maybe putting a checkpoint closer to the boss would have been kinder. But at the same time, I mean, once you traversed it once, it's less of a challenge. At least if you don't bring an NPC in. If you bring Solaire in, it's a nightmare. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he will stop to fight every single enemy on the way to the boss door. And that's actually also something they improved for Dark Souls 2. I didn't notice until I was playing off screen recently, but they did. Like if you just haul ass, your NPCs usually will as well.
Yeah, but that's more generally a problem linked to the programming of the AI rather than really the game design being antagonistic in itself. Like, even if they knew that the AI was terrible, they didn't plan it around to penalize the player. They just knew and said, "Well, they'll figure it out."
That actually ties into another point on my massive ass list of criteria. But just really quickly, other things I would like to throw out there, unrelated to like the Dark Souls discussion, but things I think about when I think antagonistic design. So much of it to me is about depriving the player of information or the opportunity to acquire information, and then punishing them for what I would call a lack of prescience, or this effective expectation on the part of the player to be clairvoyant. This is something you see a lot of times in old school CRPGs, right? And yes, I understand to some people there is some charm to wandering into a new map and getting steamrolled by something 5-10 levels higher than yourself. But the issue I have in regards to that is narratively, mechanically, how am I supposed to intuit what should or shouldn't lead to a failure state when a game isn't designed like Dark Souls? When the result of a failure state isn't me being sent back, maybe with shortcuts open, maybe at the most 30 to 60 seconds worth of progress, and instead having to reload an earlier save and replay minutes or like sometimes an hour of the game because I didn't know a challenge that was not telegraphed in any way, shape, or form was presented to me, or because whatever tools that had been sufficient for me to deal with all of the other challenges in a set, in an area, in a quest line, what have you, for whatever reason were arbitrarily insufficient to deal with one that was not necessarily poorly designed, but maybe improperly balanced. And this is something I see a lot regarding like online discussions of what we would term antagonistic design. And MC, you mentioned this in I think one of Seth's streams earlier. You're absolutely right. Games that are just kind of clunky or poorly balanced or optimized are somehow lionized as paragons of real challenge or difficulty, when it's like maybe that wasn't intended in the first place.
Oh yeah, and that's true for a lot of things in games. Generally, you don't really expect anything. You just try to do your best with what you got, and then the challenge arises from that, and people kind of get excited by it for some reason. Like in Dark Souls, to take that example, you can get stuck on the geometry quite often, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see that as antagonistic per se. I just see that as clunkiness, and well, you get used to it basically, and it's fine. But when you never played that game, it's kind of frustrating to just
Sure.
stumble on that. And saying get good on that kind of stuff is, well, get good.
No, exactly. And thank you for bringing that up, because I wanted to talk as well. Let me see, is there anything else I'm missing on my first page of notes? Because there's a lot. Um, yeah, there's this issue, this broader issue that doesn't have to deal with development so much as the feedback loop that, especially in esoteric, like kind of niche audiences like that which exists for CRPGs in the present, that developers have to be cautious of not falling into, right? Because Dark Souls, I think we might have mentioned this on stream before or on an earlier episode of the Overanalysts, you wouldn't know it based on Western marketing and like the discourse that's developed around it in Western gaming communities. But difficulty, like just being hard, just being challenging, is not remotely a cornerstone of the Dark Souls design ethos. Not at all. The idea is about learning and exploration and growth and empowerment. Dark Souls and Demon Souls, first, is meant only to provide the player with enough challenge to really play around with and have fun with the tool set that the game gives them, so that when you find a combination of mechanics and tools and items and gear that works for you, it feels like a triumph of the spirit. You feel like you learned something and you're having fun. It's good, it's positive, it's rewarding. It's not meant, first and foremost, just to smack people down so that only a small, quote unquote, elite echelon of the player base can triumph over the game and understand, what it's really about. The same applies to, I think, at least in intent, a lot of classic CRPGs. Like, they weren't meant to be prohibitively difficult. A lot of them were due to just kind of clunkiness of design or what have you. But that's something that a small kind of harmful subset of the player base really latched onto and extolled as, this is what this type of game, this is what this type of experience is really about. It's about exclusion, right? It's about saying, because so many people can't or won't do these things or beat these games, That's why we enjoy them. We are somehow better than them because we can do these things. And to me, that's just preposterous. Like these are toys. This is a form of entertainment, and I think people should be able, within reason, to engage with them in any capacity, with any relative scaling of difficulty that feels rewarding for them. And gatekeeping, exclusionism, elitism should not be a part of the culture or the audience that developers try specifically to develop for. And generally, it's not.
It actually never is. No, we don't try to make games because we want some people to play them and not everyone. It's
Right.
generally quite the contrary. We want as many people to play them as we can, so we can also learn from that. But in general, well, money is fine, but you know, uh, but there's still really it's really interesting because every time you build a game, the community will either be quite open-minded or very, very close-minded.
Mm-hmm.
And for the uplink community, that's kind of the things we have with Unlink, where it is close-minded. And I don't completely agree with that because, uh, well, it's unfair for people who never played the game in the first place
Right.
to just expect them to be good. But at the same time, when I advertise on Link, I say, okay, the difficulty has been increased because people who played the base uplink game were not really satisfied with the difficulty anymore. So expect it to be difficult. I recommend playing the first game and then come back to it. We will
Mm-hmm.
answer a question, but know that it will be difficult. And generally, that leave everyone a little more open to new players rather than saying, yeah, well, if you don't know, you need to guess because that's how the game works. It's it's part of it should be a part of the development team to actually uh, change that mentality rather than saying than piling on the game maybe flows, maybe uh, decision making that were meant to make it harder, and just tell the community, don't be dicks around that.
Right, right. And you're explaining something that I think, again, is so important if you're going to be adopting. Not, again, this isn't what you're describing isn't antagonistic design, it's just like a game meant to be quite challenging. Being open and honest and explicit with that, like, hey, this is the type of experience you can expect. And here's why we elected to pursue that design strategy. Nothing at all wrong with that. I think that's fantastic. I think more developers should do that, not just based around challenge, but like what's actually in their games, right? Like, how many times have you heard somebody like from Ubisoft say, oh, we've got this vast open world the size, I don't know, the size of Texas, with so much visceral, engrossing, completely immersive content. And it's like, yeah, but what do I do there? Like, what are you selling me? You know, that's something
Yeah.
that more developers should strive for. That kind of candor.
I agree on that, but even then, the issue there that you are bringing on with the open worldness of game is that generally they are not meant to be challenges. They are just meant
No,
to be junk food that you can
a Skinner
consume after
box.
work. Yeah, and the main issue with these games is that they try to keep player interest by giving rewards at every corners rather than making the reward a consequence of a challenge. And then from that point, you can see a little bit of why antagonistic is a little better because you want to create a barrier between the player and the reward with an encounter, either fair or unfair, depending on the the value of the reward. Like if you have a game breaking item, you might put game breaking enemies in it.
Yes, absolutely. If this is something else I had written down that I think is important, because a lot of games, especially the old CRPGs I associate with antagonistic design quite broadly, don't seem to understand this, and it's one of my kind of one of the black marks I hold against antagonistic design as a whole is usually, and this is one area where antagonistic design and like modern AAA open world design actually fall afoul of the same like poor element or aspect of design in my mind, is rewards do not feel as though they substantially impact or expand the player's toolkit or the ways in which they engage with the game. Now, they do so in two very wildly different ways, right? If I'm playing an open world game, like, God help me, if I decided, like, man, I don't need these 80 hours in my life, and decide to, like, play through an Ubisoft open world game because I hate myself. Um, so many of the rewards I end up uncovering, right, are incremental. They have absolutely nothing or usually little to do with my character's moveset, with the types of actions I can perform or can't perform, with the permissions to enter certain areas of the world. Instead, they just make the number go up a little bit, right? They're stat boosts, almost always. And these tend to feel very hollow when, as the stats increase, so too do the enemy's stats. So really, insofar as my like baseline experience as a player, it feels like nothing is changing, nothing is improving or iterating. I'm just kind of mindlessly watching these integers increase on my side and on the enemy's side. Nothing about the ways in which we interact is substantially changed.
They are
And
not
in the case of
challenged. They are not challenged because you don't feel a sense of accomplishment.
there's no variation either. It's the same thing from start to finish, appreciably. But in the case of these older games that I would argue espouse antagonistic design, the issue often is, okay, I gain like a superior item, I gain a new ability or what have you, and immediately the difficulty curve or like the expectations of the player is ratcheted up by such a significant degree that I don't feel empowered whatsoever. I feel as though I'm still just barely skimming the surface with multiple resets or what do they call them in the old days? Reloads or what have you. So it doesn't feel as though my toolkit is expanding. It's feeling as though it's contracting, closing up behind me just as I gain the new item, just as I gain the new thing, which doesn't mean that I'm supposed to be having an easier time of the game as I go along necessarily, but rather that again, most of the tools, most of the items or party members or equipment that I uncover, the abilities should feel viable in some way, shape, or form if I really want to put in the effort to make them so. And in a lot of these old games, I feel like that isn't the case. The ones that are handled poorly, that is. Some, like Baldur's Gate 2, Planescape Torment, they avert this quite spectacularly. But
Yeah, I was playing Pool of Ardeans, Runes of Midranor to prepare for this podcast because it's still one of my favorite bad game that exists, and
right?
it's only bad because of the bug, but the game in general manages to be bland in the exploration, but never uninteresting because of the atmosphere that it presents. So you can traverse off the map and still find enjoyment in it just because there are random encounters that can appear. You're never sure that you will encounter them, so that's that's why it can be bland. But there's always an atmosphere to it that cancels that. And behind every tough monster, there is a piece of loot that will not only help you on your quest, but also be quite rewarding. Like, more often than not, you can find magic items that will help you unlock other areas where one enemies would just instantly kill you otherwise. And the game is not even trying to tell you that you will survive any encounter. It will straight up kill you any chance it gets, and just by following the D&D rule set. But what's interesting about that is you can throw yourself at an encounter and maybe succeed with the tools that you are given, or come back later with better tools. And you can always put flags on the map to say, okay, I couldn't do that encounter, maybe later. And in that sense, the game is can be quite an enemy of the player because uh, there are there are really, really tough monster in beginners area. So it's quite unfair when you look about it. But I think it's also quite interesting because with the flag that you can put on, it's not. It's helping the player even though it's trying to go against the player. If you see what I mean.
Right, it's giving you tools that you can use to not exactly circumvent challenge, but face it on terms that are more amicable to you than maybe when you first encounter these challenges.
Yeah, that's correct.
No, I think that's fascinating, and I think that's an aspect of, or a singular element of the design that's good, or encourages the player to think about the game and its world in a way that is maybe a little unorthodox to not just modern game design, but game design as a whole. Okay, I've got this massive ass world full of encounters. Which ones do I think are safe? Which ones will I need to delay for later? And the game gives me tools like cartographic tools that I can use to keep track of all of these. Like, that is not inherently a bad thing. I think that's quite good.
Hollow Knight does it too, if I remember correctly, by
Yeah,
flagging some areas.
I believe it does. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Um, what else do I have though? Before we get on to my specific examples that I'm going to use, because I wrote down, as it happens, entirely too much stuff. As yeah, surprising. I know Brady has a lot to say, and it's poorly organized, right? Um, really, what I think epitomizes this type of design to me, though, and I sat for like a couple hours trying to think of the best, most obvious examples of antagonistic design I could. So many of them, so many of them are CRPGs, like old school isometric Western style RPGs that would have been popular on computers back in the day, but also more modern games that attempt to emulate that style of design. And I kept wondering, well, okay, why is it that this genre seems to have isolated and retained so many aspects of antagonistic design when other games, even when they're challenging, even when they're really engaging, like Souls-likes, seem to have embraced, get this, not just not making the games easier, because in many cases they aren't, but quality of life measures that make the management of one's own tools, one's own abilities far more direct and straightforward, more accessible and understandable to the player. Is, well, I came up with a couple reasons, or a couple like distinctions that we can draw there. One of them isn't just excessive punishment, one of them isn't the embrace of clunkiness or sometimes imbalanced game design as an integral or desirable part of challenge, which does, for what it's worth, seem to be more popular amongst that crowd for whatever reason. But that these games also tend to embrace tedium to a certain extent in a very different way than the modern open world game does. The latter is repetition or tedium through repetition. The former favors tedium through what I would consider excessive like micromanagement of game systems and UI on the player's part. Like, okay, if anything can wipe me out and I'm not going to be given sufficient foreshadowing to determine, okay, there's a difficult encounter coming up ahead, or I'm about to enter a new zone or what have you, then I'm going to be juggling like 50 some odd save states simultaneously and micromanaging my inventory and what have you for every encounter, not just for those that seem like stylistically, narratively, they would merit it. But also, then, there is little to no integration in so many of these games, Dig, in of gameplay and narrative. The latter is often seen or presented as a nice set dressing for the former. And in a lot of CRPGs, then, the newer ones especially, I'm thinking of well, one or two use cases I'm going to bring out in like the back half of this episode. Um, Actually attempting to become engrossed in a game's narrative or its world as it's presented to you, the player, with all the tools concomitant with the same role playing tools, right? Like thinking, oh, maybe I want to play a really diplomatic character and avoid conflict as often as I can. Or maybe I want to align myself with this faction and pursue their quest line, is often in a lot of the games I'm thinking of directly and immediately penalized. You're not supposed to be role playing. You're not supposed to be getting largely or completely immersed in the world or in the tool set the abilities that go along with your class, the types of weapons and armor we presented to you, the party members we presented that you might want to take along due to their narrative hooks. You're not supposed to be getting immersed in that because you're supposed to be a power gamer. Just for those who aren't familiar, and feel free to correct me, those of you who are more familiar with tabletop than I, but for our audience who doesn't have the context, power gaming or min maxing in a narrative driven tabletop or role playing game experience usually refers to an approach that tends to emphasize what's going on under the hood, the mechanical underpinnings of, say, optimizing your character and the way they work mechanically, emphasizing this stat, emphasizing acquiring these skills or those items as quickly as possible, with little to no regard for the role playing aspects of the same, with building a character that feels good to you, with interacting with the world in ways that feel natural or like they would come sensibly to your character. You view it as more of a spreadsheet and like the way you would play a JRPG than you would a tabletop game. Is that largely correct, by the way? Is that a correct definition?
That's correct, but also what you might not know is that actually in in the definition of roleplay, there are many different kind of players, and some of them will be more interested in min-maxing, some of them will be more interested in the roleplay elements, and you cannot really blame them to want something like that in a game and to expect something like that from a game. It's the kind of player who will say get good, but it's how they like to interact with a game, and I think there's some. I mean, it's interesting to give them something to play on that level if they really want to. And of course, it's not going to be interesting for everyone. There are definitely games out there that are for that caters to that kind of audience, and even those who want to try to get into it can somewhat do so with little experience. But there's there's a certain interest in trying to make something as challenging as possible for that type of audience. And the real problem there, I would say, is if the audience reacts against other rather than trying to help others.
Yes, definitely. And I think something that we need to consider, or especially as like audiences cognizant of the way game design works presently, is offering as many different, as is reasonable, right? As many different options for if you've got a really mechanically rich game, tweaking the mechanics, tweaking the way that challenge or that player agency is going to be presented to your taste, right? This is something that I will say the Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 enhanced editions seem to do really remarkably well. Like from the outset, there's something like what, 7 different difficulty settings. um I want to say one that is roughly equivalent with Dungeons and Dragons baseline rules, like just taken straight from the rulebook, plopped into the game. 3 that are slightly gentler with the player, and 3 that are even more difficult and more encouraging of like hardcore min maxing. And so there's a kind of experience, roughly speaking, that's curated for anyone, right? And that I think should be encouraged. If you're going to adopt an antagonistic approach, you should. This is just me, but this is what I would like to advance. If you're gonna do that, it should either have serious artistic, narrative, or otherwise aesthetic merit. There should be a reason beyond making a really hard game that some people might enjoy because it plays against them, or it should be optional and probably not the default way in which your game, your world are presented to players unless you're very explicit about that fact.
And that is something that you see more and more in the modern TRPG
Mm-hmm.
genre. Like, for example, Divinity Original Sin 2, which added various type of modes, like story mode for those who really didn't want to participate in combat, or tactician mode, which is for those who really want to get into the combat.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great. I endorse that wholeheartedly, and I think that again, when you have a system that's so mechanically rich, oh God help me, I'm about to bring up my kind of not exactly a straw man, but probably a game that handles antagonistic design more poorly than any other I've ever seen that was, reasonably successful. But I'm going to bring it up to praise it here. God damn it, that's something that Pathfinder Kingmaker does really well.
It does,
That
doesn't
game,
it?
from a mechanical perspective, is so shitty in so many ways, but they do allow the player to toggle individual mechanics like how much health would you ideally like your party members to have? How much should enemies have? Would you like to rest to restock XYZ? Here's a million different spectra, so they're not just toggles. You've got little sliders. That's really cool. Um, it's about the only thing about the game's balance that's handled well, but that's really
Mm.
cool.
Well,
But to the point of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I would say for that game specifically, the main issue, and I don't know if it's still an issue because I haven't played it since the latest update, but the kingdom aspect was handled poorly, but the actual
Yeah.
combat is really adherent to the rules, which is both antagonistic for those who never have had enough experience with D&D, but also very, very cool for those who have a little bit of knowledge of it because they can learn from it. They can they can use that knowledge to really make the game their own. So
Okay.
it's interesting.
It is, and hold that thought because we're going to circle back around to that. I did some digging into like the way Pathfinder Kingmaker was designed and presented, and this was late last night. I learned mechanically under the hood there is some obscene shit going on with the way that game handles combat, but we'll get around to that. So I'm glad you brought up Divinity Original Sin 2 because I actually really like the way those games handle combat. Especially like there's this for those who aren't aware. It's kind of sort of a turn-based RPG where the player is given a certain amount of points or like a total, right, that can be spent on movement and action per round, almost like a free roaming non-grid based XCOM or something similar.
No, that's a
Um,
fair assessment.
and the ways in which you can interact with enemies or with the environment, right? The way that fire can spread out across like spilt oil or like a field of tall grass is amazing. And I love everything about it. But I mentioned earlier that a lot of CRPGs that embrace antagonistic design do so specifically in regards to their narrative elements. What do I mean by this? I'm not talking just about not being able to play a character who never fights or can't fight worth a damn, and then being surprised when you get rolled by like a giant ogre or Etten or something, right? No, no, no. I'm talking specifically about the ways in which certain games handle dialogue options, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also the way in which games like Divinity sometimes explicitly punish player agency or consistent role playing. Now, this is a problem that was fixed in the second game, if I'm correct. But you guys, Tina and Mate as well, you guys are familiar with the way the single player campaign of the first game handled persuasion, right? Yeah, so for the uninitiated in our audience, the game had a really interesting persuasion mechanic that was essentially based around rock, paper, scissors, with you or your conversation partner earning points for every like favorable matchup. Like it would keep going until one of you got. I think it differed depending on what you were trying to convince somebody of, how difficult it
Mm.
was, or how skilled you were. But usually, what MC somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 points, roughly.
Yeah, that was correct, and that's correct. If
Yeah.
you need to do it several times just to be able to win. And the thing about that is everyone knew it was completely terrible and no one should do it like that. Um, it's actually kind of a patch for the single player experience because in multiplayer you only have to do it if neither player agree to a situation and then they might fight it, or they can talk about it and decide who should win, that kind of stuff. And they can, the way that can evolve is that each player tries to play a role, and then they argue as player as who should uh, win the argument, and then from the character's perspective, they fight, sort of. So yeah, it was more of a patch for the single player experience, and it was a
Mm-hmm.
terrible way to handle it. They
And
they agree
just
to it.
to give additional context to the audience once again, um, by default, like I think a lot of the game was designed with like two-player co-op in mind, and it's really cool if the players were to disagree as to how a quest should be resolved or which among several moral or ethical options they should choose, they would get to play the persuasion minigame against each other to decide which course of action would ultimately be taken if they couldn't decide, independent of themselves, as MC just said. But here's the thing: in the single player campaign, your second, what would normally be your co-op partner's character, is controlled by the AI, and they are hard coded to develop a personality and ethos that directly contrasts your own. What this means is, no matter what moral choices you make at any point throughout the game, your co-op partner, the CPU, will step in and force you into a, by its very nature, largely random persuasion minigame that has a very good chance of resulting in you being forced to do something you find reprehensible, just by luck of the coin. This happens every single time, no matter how significant or insignificant the moral choice, with very rare exceptions. Now, yes, I also agree with MC. This is a fairly unusually pronounced form of antagonistic design, but I would argue it's also pretty quintessentially antagonistic. If you want to roleplay a character consistently, totally outside of combat, which this doesn't affect really in any measure whatsoever, we're going to punish you for that because you should, well, ideally be playing it with two players. Or also, you should be convincing everyone of your rhetoric, of your morals, constantly.
There is a reward for sticking up to your morals, even though you have to play that minigame. Is that you actually get points into specific
Yes, you do.
branch for completing it. You can get stat upgrades and that kind of stuff. So it's not completely useless. And over the course of the game, it gets less and less present. So it's really in the starting area that it's
Okay.
pretty bad.
And the other major example I wanted to bring to the fore, and I've got several others here, I just don't want to drag us out, for ages and ages, is the way, the many ways in which Pathfinder Kingmaker handles its role playing and narrative elements, or, sorry, role playing and narrative, listen to me, role playing and gameplay elements, or rather the fact that it doesn't attempt to integrate them much at all. So for what it's worth, I feel the need to give a disclaimer. Despite everything you're about to hear, I kind of like Pathfinder Kingmaker. It's a beautiful game. Visually, it's great. Like, the soundtrack is pretty bog standard, but perfectly robust. The voice cast is fantastic. The characters likable. The plot, directly adapted from one of the most popular Pathfinder adventure campaigns of all time, is phenomenal. I really, really enjoy the game's world and the opportunity to engage with it. And the opportunities you have to express and develop your character, almost unrivaled in any other like big budget modern like CRPG. Really, it's phenomenal. You can be so many different types of person, you can be so many different classes or syntheses thereof. You sometimes get as many as, what is it, MC? Like as many as a dozen different resolutions to certain quests, depending on what you do. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it also varies depending on what you did earlier, which character you
Mm-hmm.
met earlier. So there's there's a lot of content to play around in that game.
And it's all of the narrative content, for better or worse, is so detailed, so rich, so good. And that's why I absolutely despise its gameplay. Let me explain. Pathfinder works not dissimilarly to Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2. That is to say, it's a very straightforward adaptation of the rules used for a popular tabletop gaming system. In this case, of course, it's the Pathfinder adventure system. And to the best of my knowledge, my tabletop savvy friends here can correct me if I'm wrong, but Pathfinder, at least in its base edition, was maybe, according to some people, a little bit trickier or more finicky than D&D 3.5e, but not by much.
The grappling rule. The grappling rule.
Yeah, the grappling rule. But the game itself, compared to a Baldur's Gate, compared to the games that used a D&D inspired mechanical design that were produced by BioWare, like I think Neverwinter Nights, KOTOR, both of which are games I enjoy and can play, certainly not perfectly, but reasonably well. I'm not the worst tactical RPG player in the world. Pathfinder is brutal. It is one of the hardest, probably the hardest CRPG I've ever played, unless we're counting Baldur's Gate 1 at the very beginning, if you play a mage and get unlucky enough to run into a wolf on your way to like the second map.
Definitely did that.
Every time, and again, that I would argue is not necessarily antagonistic design so much as it is just really clunky in balancing. Here's the issue with Pathfinder, though, why it's so brutal. And people dug into the game and looked into this. Because the devs, while presenting a remarkable amount of narrative choice, largely adapted, as near as we can figure out as like a community, their house rules into the way the game was designed and played. And the game encourages, by its fundamental design, pretty extensive power gaming. So if you don't know exactly how every class in the game works, and if you're playing like a spellcaster or someone like that, if you don't know what all of the like dozens and dozens and dozens of spells and abilities available to you do, which ones you should take at what level and when, you just try to feel your way through the game, not only are you going to have a bad time, you'll probably have to restart several times. And a lot of this isn't really competently telegraphed to the player, but that's not the issue in and of itself either. Sorry, two more things, then I guess the prosecution will rest. One, the game has so many wonderful narrative options, like diplomacy checks, persuasion checks, checks that depend at least in part on your relationship with other characters in the world. But this is something I wish single-player games would do away with. I see the purpose of spontaneity in a tabletop setting. They have them all set to like base off of roll 20s with stat modifiers. Now, it's true that in Pathfinder, by like mid-game, if you dump everything you have into diplomacy, as I did because I was a good angel boy, you will very rarely fail a persuasion check. Notice I said very rarely and not never. But in the early game, even if you're trying to develop your character in a diplomatic fashion, towards a diplomatic, like kind of charisma-driven direction, which would mean they're going to be weaker, of course, it's still highly unlikely you're going to be able to do several of the things that you believe you should be able to do based on your base stats or based on other things you've done in the world, because you'll get a single bad roll and usually be thrown into a confrontation or something that you just aren't prepared for because, again, you set about resolving things differently. And what about those confrontations then, huh? Well, oftentimes in the game, you'll succeed at a diplomatic check or diplomacy check or a persuasion check, receive a little bit of extra info that is legitimately useful later on, and then usually be thrown into a fight against the people you were trying to persuade anyway. It's something that, if I'm correct, in Pathfinder happens all the goddamn time. But when you're in those fights, you'll notice, that wolf or that centipede's a whole hell of a lot stronger than I thought it would be. And you know why this is? Because at least, I don't believe at launch, I believe consistently, they jacked the stats of all the enemies in the game through the roof compared to their tabletop counterparts. For instance, there was this famous screenshot going around not long after launch depicting an early game encounter, relatively early game, sorry, like maybe level 6, level 7, what have you, against 3 owlbears, pretty tanky like magical chimera creatures. But they had the owlbear's stats, specifically their base attack bonus, displayed on screen. You know, the likelihood that they'll be able to hit someone and the amount of damage they'll do if they do manage to hit home. And each of these owlbears, according to the Pathfinder rules, had stats in excess of an adult, like, massive black dragon. More health, more attack, more defense, more everything, and they're going up against players or characters at a level that should not be getting anywhere near a single dragon. And they're fighting 3 of them as part of like a random encounter or whatever. So Pathfinder shot the stats of every single enemy, as far as I can tell, through the roof. And according to the devs, part of it was to compensate for the fact that, well, your party can be up to 6 people instead of up to 4. But when so many of the rolls based on these stats have to do with, like, the likelihood that you can hit someone, the likelihood you'll crit, how much damage you do, it feels to me like increasing the amount of creatures or enemies present in an encounter modifies difficulty in a far more fair and far more effective way than increasing the stats, increasing the overall power of the creatures you already have well in excess of what it should be, what players should be able to handle from them. And this is something Pathfinder did to such a ridiculous extent that it impeded the ability of a lot of players, myself included, to really play the game we wanted to unless we dropped the difficulty through the floor, because the systems themselves were horribly imbalanced, and if we didn't want to min-max in power game, then it just wasn't going to work for us even on normal settings. So Pathfinder, to me, is the modern epitome of antagonistic design as designed.
And
But
yes,
wait,
yeah, go ahead.
are you saying like no matter if your party had like you or like 6 people,
Yeah.
their stats would be the same?
Yes.
What the fuck? That's not how it works. I mean, yes, like in like D&D and tabletop RPGs, you have set stats for all the creatures, or like guidelines how to roll them if you want to make them more randomized. So
Yeah.
if your party's an asshole and they're trying to metagame, but like yes, like what you said, how you moderate the difficulty of an encounter is by changing the amount of creatures. Or you don't have to necessarily add more owl bears. You can add more other
Yes,
creatures
of
that are
course.
slightly weaker, just to fine tune it. Jesus fucking Christ!
Yeah, owlbears stronger than adult dragons.
And yeah, right. So yeah, I want to say that Pathfinder, I managed to go far into the game using the hardest difficulty, and still manage to not min-max every character. So it's possible. It's a challenge, but it's possible. And I did enjoy it, especially once I got through the base encounter and started being able to not die on every single one of them. It was because they do throw a lot of swarm enemies in the start of the game, and
Yes, they do.
that is kind of bad if you don't know how to deal with them. But yeah, you're correct in that that game is particularly unfair towards the player, but it's also what kind of make it enjoyable for me. And
Okay.
even even if I think that for most players they should put it at the minimal amount of difficulty if they want to have some good time with it, it's still it's still not impossible to beat, and can be it can be mastered.
No, not at all. And again, the point I kind of want to drive home here in regards to games like this is not in the least that they should not, or this type of mode, this type of experience should not be available, should not be curated. It's that it should not be, as my understanding is from my own experience and reading other players' comments, including professional Pathfinder DMs who said, there's one comment that said something to the extent of, and I love this, I've been running like a pretty consistent Pathfinder tabletop at my local hobby shop for about 4 years now. And if I tried this on my team, if I put this encounter against my team, they would revolt. um, like lots of professionals, people who were used to the tabletop game and wanted a faithful adaptation said that on the normal settings, the game as intended,
These
it
are
wasn't what they were
yeah.
expecting because the difficulty was so excessively enhanced, often arbitrarily. And so I think that presenting a fair, non-antagonistic challenge to the player by default, challenge, just non-antagonistic, should be the gold standard. It should be what people aim for. It should be what people curate for their players. And having these more restrictive, these more prohibitive, these more demanding modes, obviously as like optional modes of engagement with the game for those who really want them, for people, MC, maybe like you, who really like an intense challenge and derive more enjoyment out of games when faced with one, is absolutely advisable. My issue is with games like Pathfinder, games like single player Divinity, games like, oh god, Pokemon Reborn, another one I could talk about if we had the time, but won't. That have these prohibitive antagonistic systems established as the default and expect players to either conform to a fairly narrow range of solutions, or worse, to police one another when they say, hey, maybe this isn't the best way to go about this, as the Pathfinder devs kind of, as I understand it, kind of relied on their community to do.
What is really weird about Pathfinder is that they did a beta tester, so they had people to actually
Mm-hmm.
see how the game would fare, and nobody really complained about it. So um, I think the
Now,
game in itself was already uh, quite narrow in terms of the audience that it would gather, and then
yes.
it cracked open, and yeah, people saw it was not necessarily all right. And I agree with you that uh, the slider of difficulty should generally be put toward the lower end rather than the higher end. That's something that should be considered, but it shouldn't be removed. The difficulty shouldn't be removed because
No.
players won't be able to enjoy it.
Um, and regarding the beta test, it's interesting you brought that up because I found scores of comments saying just the opposite. Hold on, let me head to Reddit. According to one of the beta testers, Reddit username Mr. Slanky, uh, in response to somebody who said this is on like the owl bear picture, which just went pseudo viral on the subreddit. Um, Somebody said, "Oh, I guess I'll just wait for a couple months of patches or what have you." Mr. Slanky says, "Quote: Don't hold your breath. These balance issues were regularly brought up in beta as early as May when I started getting involved, and we were told repeatedly that balance was where they wanted it due to it being a CRPG and not pen and paper. The number of complaints regarding this topic has more than vindicated the opinions many of us were chastised for having during the beta." So my understanding is they yeah, the creative director told them that everything is just how they wanted it, and if you think it's too hard, just like scale all of the difficulty sliders down to the very base, which is certainly an approach, but it feels like the devs just didn't want to hear anything from the people who were playtesting the game for them and saying not like, oh, this is, I don't like this because it's hard, but I'm having a really difficult time with this and I'm not sure what else I should be doing. And that, I think, is where the prohibitive element of a lot of this comes in. Like, people who funded the game and wanted it exactly, the way Baldur's Gate would be delivered or something like that, were saying, no, this is preposterous.
Yeah, and I mean on that, to close that off, I would say that it's difficult to really figure out the difficulty of a game when you are playing it over and over yourself,
Yes,
and listening to the audience is sometimes weird because you cannot get an aggregate of what everyone is saying, and you get a viewpoint that is completely different, so you have to balance the two. And on that, often when you try to go antagonistically against the player, you go too far,
of
either
course.
through bad design of the game, bad mechanics, or, uh, as I said in the beginning, breaking the rules of what you expect in the game by
Hmm.
making something completely different. But it's hard to figure out if it's something that needs to be removed or something that needs to be clarified, because
Right.
both can find a resolution, but sometimes removing it is will make more people angry than it should. And in the modern game design, it's definitely something that is not often considered. What could be more challenging for the player, even maybe at the cost of being too difficult until we can fix it.
No, absolutely, and that's something that a professional like game critic named Joshua Beiser, who runs a wonderful podcast, YouTube channel, and website called Game Wisdom, which I highly recommend to our entire audience, has spoken about before, in regards to the problem of pain points in game design, or what he calls pain points. It's something we've discussed in passing on the podcast before, but I think it's particularly salient here, because the pain point is like a subjective measurement, or a subjective experience of a mechanic, of an encounter, something about the game that causes a player to become not challenged, not invested, but frustrated, right? Something that makes me unhappy, and not in the way necessarily that getting like smeared into paste by Ludwig the Accursed 87 times on stream did. That makes me more determined. I want to do this. I know I can do this. Come on, head in the game. But that makes me feel like, oh, playing this isn't very fun. This is kind of tedious. This is kind of demanding. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And he spoke, Mr. Beiser did, with an associate of his who's a game developer, and they regularly in like their talks espoused the value of playtesting and really competently assessed playtesting. You're absolutely right, MC, in that if you're creating something, I know this as like somebody who works in the academy. We have the same issue trying to get like professional researchers to just talk to people or teach them without talking down to them, like their children or what have you. Um it's difficult to take something that has been your entire life, that you know like the back of your hand, and sit back and experience it like relatively, subjectively, as an outsider would. And it's also difficult then if you get something totally different than your experience relayed to you by playtesters to not go, well, I don't see how on earth they didn't realize this, or what made them think that. And so what Mr. Beiser and his associate emphasize in like their article on this, as well as I think it was part of a podcast episode, is that it's important to step back and, as you said, attempt to extract an aggregate of feedback from your playtesters and try to get as many diverse playtesters with diverse experience and backgrounds to run through your game as you can. Because if I'm a hardcore like tabletop role-playing gamer and I take my like CRPG and only shop it around to other people who are very, very familiar with those systems, odds are I'm going to get a very different set of feedback than I would if I presented it to people who play console RPGs or RPGs more broadly, or people who have never played an RPG in their life but really like fantasy games, or what have you, and trying to extrapolate what a general like audience's perception might be.
Yeah, no, that's why you make beta testing in the first place. It's to really get the opinion of various genre of people. You try to get their assessment, and different player will have different experience. If you cater to a specific audience, then beta testing for them makes sense. But if you want to get your game over different 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 population, you need to open up.
Yeah, absolutely. And my final point for today, because I think we've run through most of the points on my massive ass list, TM, um, pertains to something that MCU you talked on Seth's stream yesterday about, like I want to be the guy, the old like Kaizo
Mm.
platformer, as a like textbook example of antagonistic design, right?
Well, it's more complicated than that because I want to be the guy who was made by someone who was told over and over again that he couldn't make an hard game. Everything that he was doing, it was easy and really boring.
Mm-hmm.
And he went on to make a point that he could make something really difficult, and he made that game to show it. That that game was made to be antagonistic, but beatable, just
Yes.
for the passionate.
But the interesting thing about a game like I Want to Be the Guy, or the other games that immediately called to mind, the Kaizo Mario titles, are you guys familiar?
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
They're a series of, for our audience, a series of like ROM hacks of usually the earlier Mario Brothers games, like Mario Brothers 1 through World, are the ones you most commonly see adapted, with
Mhm.
lots of very I Wanna Be the Guy esque sudden death traps, like clouds that kill you, that appear to be background elements that kill you if you make contact with them. Most every mushroom's a poison mushroom. The ground will fall away beneath your feet apropos of nothing, and so on and so on. They're kind of early what would go on the internet to be known as rage games, right?
Mm.
Mhm.
And
Um, and
they even have a specific thing that goes into Kaizo that doesn't appear in I Wanna Be the Guy, I believe, is the invisible blocks that will
yep,
absolutely kill you if you make the wrong jump at the wrong point, like appear out of nowhere and send you
yep.
to your death.
And here's the thing. Here's what I would argue, and I am willing to like fight and die on this hill. I Want to Be the Guy, Kaizo Mario, games like that, they're not good games. Of course they're not. They're frustrating, and maybe people are entranced by the challenge of completing it just so they can say they did. It's an accomplishment, right? The same way that, like, getting over it with Bennett Foddy, another terrible game would be. But here's the thing we don't like those games, and we don't know those games. All of us sitting around our computers today, because they're good, we know them vicariously through an emergent online marketplace for frustration, for challenge, for watching other people as like video game content curated and created by others, right? Watching people play games instead of playing them ourselves has become increasingly mainstream. We are drawn to and we can appreciate these games that put screwing the player over or introducing absurd and sudden difficulty more than we would have had we to play them ourselves, in which case I don't think many of us would have enjoyed them much at all, because we're able to experience them with and through someone else. The development of platforms like YouTube and like Twitch have also given rise to what I call like a market of vicarious misery, where I might not want to play one of these games, and I will tell you right now, I do not. I do not. But I might want to see somebody else try their hand at it, especially like if there's somebody I know, a content creator whose work I enjoy, or if it's YouTube circa 2006 and they just scream until my ears bleed because that was comedy back then.
There's another way to enjoy these kinds of games is to watch them being speedrunned, because speedrunning
Yes,
on those games are really, really nice and makes them game in that way. But there are speedrun games, I would argue.
of course they are, and you're right. Some of the speed runs for things like I Want to Be the Guy are works of art. Like it's
Mm.
incredible what some people are able to memorize and then execute. But I think we need to appreciate the distinction as well. This certainly doesn't apply to Pathfinder because nobody is watching like a 3 hour stream like, oh man, I can't wait to see more attempts against like the grandfather today. Ha ha. But for a lot of these games, it's important to recognize that many of us don't appreciate the game itself. We appreciate the spectacle of somebody else enduring or diving into it. We got to see this, and this is not an example of antagonistic game design. It's an example of good but really difficult game design recently on my channel with the Champions Road
Mm.
attempts on Mario 3D World that gave Tina and Mate their favorite sound clip of all time.
You can find it also a lot in um, Mario Maker 2 and Mario Maker
Mhm.
1. where they really enjoy to make really, really unfair levels for players.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's interesting because you can put people in front of it, and they will tell you that it doesn't work, it's unfair, that kind of stuff, because it breaks the rule of the world they are trying to establish. And it's both important to actually have these games because you can show that to a public and say that's why we make rules rather
Yeah.
than just removing them because they are not suitable for anyone. It's important that they are present just to be able to say we need rules, otherwise everything will break.
Right. No, I see that point exactly.
Oh, but I actually have a question for well, both of you.
Sorry.
What's your opinion on Shadow of War? Like the mechanic where the enemy that kills you gets stronger.
Um, okay, so I actually really like the Nemesis system as a whole. I think it's quite interesting. And the fact that enemies that kill you become stronger isn't necessarily antagonistic or punishing, I find, because depending on like the way a certain orc is set up, right? Many of them have one glaring weakness that persists no matter how strong they are. Like, oh, there's this war chief who's been rampaging around for hours and hours in my game, but he's still really weak to headshots, you guys. You can mess around and still take them down if need be. But if you build somebody up by feeding yourself to them a couple of times, and then brainwash them, you will gain an incredible reward in the form of a really, really potent ally. I think it's a cool system, not beyond the need for refinement, but I really wish that WB hadn't tried to trademark it because I'd like to see other games do something similar.
Yeah, I've not played that game, so I'm not too familiar with the system. But I want to say that in a way, it's a way to create a failure system in the challenge. So it might work for some people, it might not work for everyone. It's definitely something to be implemented and tested out, and uh, maybe it will not work, maybe it will. That's kind of why it exists.
Well, I believe that concludes today's discussion, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us for what turned out to be a more serious and intricate discussion than many we've had. We promise we'll get back to shitting on video game publishers before too long. But we were really, really glad to have this opportunity to dig into something a little more substantial with all of you guys. First and foremost, I want to extend a second very big thank you to our good friend MC from Ferris Moon Studios, Ferris Moon Entertainment, right?
First Moon Studio.
Studio. Yes, Ferris Moon Studio. One of the developers of a fantastic mod and working on like an independent game that we will be sure to deliver more news regarding to you just as soon as we can. Thank you so much again for joining us, man. It's been a real pleasure, and I think your insight is it was valuable to me, and I'm sure it's going to be very valuable to our audience.
Well, thank you everyone for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Is there anything you would like us to plug, or anywhere besides the studio's webpage where you would like people to be able to find you?
No, I don't exist on the internet.
All right,
You are
fair
just an
enough.
internet mystery.
Well, I
I
appear on Twitch and then I disappear.
There you go. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I am Brady the Overanalyst, joined as always by my good friends and moderators for today's debate, Martina or Seth the Overwitch,
Good night, everyone.
and Mate or Comrade Potato.
Bye bye, everybody.
And I would like to remind you all that you can follow this podcast right here on your platform of choice, as well as finding us at our new YouTube channel at The Overanalysts, where you can find ongoing archives of every single episode in an easy, interactable format. Please feel free to post any comments, questions, anything you have to us there, or send us messages via the contact form at our wonderful website, seththeoverwitch.com. It's your one-stop shop for everything we do. please keep an eye on that YouTube channel as well in the near future, as we may have some stream archives and other exciting associated projects pop up from time to time as well. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye!